originally a marshy valley between two hills known as Cornhill and Ludgate. Now a thriving metropolis with few equals. Rome has its ancient ruins for eternity. Paris is the city of light. New York has the claim to be the city that never sleeps. As for London,
very just tailored to me in a way.
What is it these days? And what was it? If, like me, you grew up in the home counties, it's fair to say that the gravitational pull of London was always strong. And like all capital cities, it has its quirks and a whole lot of dark, terrifying depths that make country mice like me yearn to be in it, but never to live in it. The London of 1794 and 2025 are almost unrecognisable from one another. Or are they? Today, I've taken my trusty recorder on the train, where it is gorgeous, sunny, blue skies. I can see St. Paul's winking at me over the second bridge here as I stand on the Jubilee Bridge overlooking Festival Pier and the South Bank. Over there is the London Eye, and there's some graffiti right in front of me that says it's shroom season, which is good to know. And underneath me the chartered Thames does indeed continue to flow. Today I aim to get to the bottom of one of the great poems from one of the great poets, William Blake's London. I'm just walking through a very, very sunny Trafalgar Square. There's a guy playing flamenco guitar. There's someone doing magic, and there's a fella on a typewriter offering poems for commission, a poem about anything that you like, pay what you want. I did a similar thing some time ago at a festival, and all I can say is good luck to that man. Rather you than me. The ubiquitous sound of London police and ambulance sirens everywhere. And straight in front of me, of course, is Nelson's column. It's an absolute hive of activity down here today. It's gorgeous. And just can't really get over the scale of everything around here. I remember when I was a little kid walking through Trafalgar Square with my dad, being just sort of in awe, just looking up all the time. And finding myself, shocked that just down there, through that little gap, I could see Big Ben, and behind me was what I thought was St. Paul's. Turns out, Riley, your Wally, it was the National Gallery, but there you go, it had a dome on it, so how was I to know? Now, I'm not alone on my venture here. I'm actually heading to meet with a member of the William Blake Society, who has very, very kindly taken time out of his day to talk to me about, the man himself. And the Blake Society have been very, very generous. I contacted them about a month ago, just asking if they would be keen to help me out or, give me a little bit of background info. And one of them very, very kindly said to me, look, I live nearby, why don't I meet you and take you on a little tour? So that's exactly what I'm going to try to do. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I see him just up ahead. And so we are, right here. William Blake was born on 28th of November 1757 in a house which stood on this site. And the space here is called William Blake House, number 8 Marshall Street, W1. John.
Joe.
Nice to meet you, John.
Hello.
How are you?
Nice to meet you. I'm good.
Nice to meet you. I stupidly stood in Golden Square for quite a long time going, where's that bloody thing that says William Blake used to live here? And then I went and I looked it up, and then I saw this and went, that'll be it.
There's not a lot. It's very kind of, we demolished his house, sorry about that. Here's a little thing.
It fits in quite well with the whole idea of how things have changed.
Well, indeed.
How long's this been here then?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is probably 60s. I don't know for sure.
It certainly looks very 60s, brutalist
Apparently
architecture.
there is. So I've never been in, but up there it's like some sort of cafe or something.
It does say Heaven and Hell Cafe.
It's definitely a Blake reference. And apparently there's something in there with some Blake sculptures or something.
Shall we have a look?
Yeah. I only found out about it recently. Maybe you could just wander in.
Well, I'll say I'm with the society.
Won't get you very far. Maybe under some illusions as to our influence.
I thought that was the whole idea.
Hello. Hey mate, we're here investigating William Blake.
Oh really?
I heard there was a room with some Blake sculpture-y things.
There is. Unfortunately, it's our meeting room.
Oh,
It's currently occupied.
No worries.
We're doing post-production. We're sadly not quite a music.
No.
But in the meeting room there's like a mural.
Yeah, because I saw photos of it the other day and had no idea.
Yeah.
I'm from the Blake Society, and this gentleman
Oh,
was
nice
making
one.
a
Yeah, we
podcast.
get quite a lot of people from.
Sure.
I don't know whether it's the same society.
Yeah, possibly.
Maybe some other day, eh?
Yeah. Okay, good to know. Yeah.
Let's see, they've got these songs of
there you
Innocence
go,
and
there we are,
experience
yeah.
right there, so it's all good. Yes. Thanks. See you later. Oh well.
There you go.
First chance denied.
I'm going to tell you the most famous short poem in Italian by Salvatore Quasimodo. And I love it just because it's one of these kind of genius little phrases that now is famous as a poem. It's Ed è subito sera. It means, and then it was night. And that's the most famous short poem in Italian.
Grazie.
Prego.
Very nice.
And that right there is why London's amazing, because you never know who you're going to bump into. It's funny, really, I was saying before I started the recording of how difficult it is to talk to people in London, because everybody is absolutely just don't even try it. I've got my earphones in, I've got my Bluetooth on, and it's a shame, really, because I feel like it can be quite a sociable place. I mean, you live here, would you say that?
Yes and no. I know what you mean. Well, it's marks of weakness, marks of woe. People are quite preoccupied. Yeah.
Quite.
But I think if you find a way of breaking through, it can happen. Can I pause you just for a second?
Of course you can.
So where Blake was born is now, it was for a long time a masala zone curry house, which was kind of nice in itself. But it is now a clothes shop, which I quite like, a somewhat overpriced clothes
So
shop.
this one here?
No, so it's more or less where Percival is, I think.
Oh, okay.
And the thing I like about that is that Blake's dad, so he grew up above a shop, and his dad was a hosier.
That's right.
And ran a hosiery shop. So it was, in its own way, a clothes shop back in the day.
So there's an element of things not really changing.
Yeah. The more
But changing
things
a lot,
change.
yes. Okay, yeah, thank you. I read about his family being in that trade. What is it about literary people and their parents being involved in clothes? I think about Shakespeare's dad being a glove maker and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, you learn these boring things when you're trained to be an English lit teacher. So this is St James's Piccadilly Church, which we just walked into, and it's surrounded by Turkish street food, paella, Korean cuisine, falafel, Sri Lankan, you name it, they're selling it, and it smells amazing. But this would have been very different to the time of Blake's attending of this church, would it not?
Yeah, I mean, you say attending the church, which is interesting in itself, because we don't really know whether he ever did, other than as a baby, being christened in, let me get this right, December 1757. That may have been the only time he came here, but this was the sort of local parish church for the Blake family. And we don't really know in what sort of faith he was brought up. We know they were probably not sort of traditional Christians, as it were, and they may have been some form of dissenters. We do now know that his mum had been at least a Moravian, which is quite a sort of fun, interesting sect of Christianity if you want to look into that.
Moravian?
Yeah, and because we know that her and her first husband were Moravians before he died. But we know he was christened here anyway.
Okay. Shall we go in, or at least pop our heads in? We might have better luck than we did with the William Blake house.
It is a beautiful church as well.
Yeah.
This is sort of technically where the Blake Society is based, although we don't really have much to do with them.
Okay.
That's what we put on events here. I don't know whether
No, looks like there is in fact some sort of sermon taking place, and I don't want to interrupt that, but wow, amazing.
You can just see from here, if you look over to your left as you're in the door, you can see the font in the corner.
Oh, yes.
So that was carved by the brilliantly named, I think I'm getting this right, Grinling Gibbons. And that is the actual font that young William Blake, among many, presumably many thousands of people, was baptised.
So a baby Blake would have maybe had his head dipped in there. Oh, would you? So we're making a podcast about William Blake. No. Did you have any connection with Blake, or besides obviously knowing this?
I have a connection with the church,
Okay.
and we celebrate him in all kinds of ways.
Oh, brilliant!
Obviously, the big anniversary's coming up, isn't it?
Yes.
So I'm sure we'll be doing stuff.
Are we allowed in? It looks like something.
It's the service going on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Nice to have friends in high places. Wow. These look like they could have been painted by him anyway,
Yeah, I mean, you really start to see, where the various influences came from. I'm not sure. I think Grinling Gibbons is probably is that 10th century? I'm not quite sure.
Well, here's the ark, and the serpent coming around. It's quite.
I'm not sure what the chariot refers to.
Well, maybe it's a chariot of fire.
Well, indeed,
they haven't set it alight just yet. There's John the Baptist, getting his branding in, obviously.
Of course.
So, is it fair to say that Blake was someone that the old joke is that he went to church 3 times? Once when he was baptised, christened. Once when he was christened, once when he was married, and then, of course, when he died. He was someone who believed in God and Jesus, but did not enjoy the way that organised religion conducted itself.
Yeah.
I'm aware that we're recording this inside a church, so I'm expecting the lightning bolt any minute.
I mean, I choose to believe in sort of Blakean God, so I think God will be fine.
Yes.
But yeah, like deeply sort of religious poet, but not perhaps quite in the way that contemporary Christians sort of recognise them. Yeah.
It's fascinating. And also really interesting to think that as we're in here, we see these stained glass windows and this incredible sort of design up at the holy end, as Larkin would have called it, is that this is still very much going.
Yeah,
very much an active place of worship.
And on the other hand, he is saying, but there's no, we create God. There's no kind of God without humans.
In my little copy of Innocence and Experience, which I studied at A-level, I've got my scrawling 17-year-old handwriting, and it says something like, we live in hell, but humans have the potential to be angels, and it's all in quotations, and I wish I knew where it's from. If it was just some bullshit that I made up. But it's the kind of idea that, if you look at a lot of his subjects of his poems, especially in Innocence and Experience, they are all either, symbols of the pure and the innocent, like the lamb or the little boy or little girl lost or the chimney sweeper, but they're also ones that have been completely taken down by societies in some cases. And then you have the tiger. Is the tiger supposed to be evil? I don't know. I think the tiger's just supposed to be dangerous, and we're looking going, oh crumbs. It's the Prometheus argument, really.
Yeah, and the way he does those contrasts, so the tiger and is a deliberate, sort of contrary, as he would say, to the lamb. As you say, 2 chimney sweepers. I mean, it's interesting that there's not, I don't think, a sort of direct contrary poem with London, except perhaps that the kind of vibe, if you like, of Songs of Innocence is much more kind of rural and kind of bucolic. And so maybe London itself, being sort of ultimate urban poem, is a sort of contrary to that.
What would be quite good, I don't know how doable this is to try and find somewhere that's slightly quieter. Slightly quieter. For me to actually do the reading of London on this. And then for us to maybe discuss it, like, if you like, when I say line by line, I mean stanza by stanza, broad brushstrokes, really.
Keeps you going. And then it's like you can't quite, you're still thinking about the last image, but you're on to the next one. And so it's almost like it's that slight sort of sensory overload of walking through an area, and you know, almost imagine like Hogarth, Gin Lane, or something.
I was about to say
the social ills is bearing down upon you.
I always try and say to my students, not that they not that they ever really seem to care, but it's written with there's 8 syllables in a line.
Yeah.
For most of them anyway, and that's, I believe, called tetrameter. So you get this exactly like you just said. It's a walking beat. So let's give it a go.
Yeah.
You know, we're walking through the somewhat nicer surrounds here of St James's Park. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
Nailed it.
Unfortunately, some bugger just, the car backfired at exactly the right point there. But in terms of the people he's describing and everything, shall we work backwards? The last stanza, I believe, he's talking about prostitution, right?
Yeah, and I think it's probably even grimmer than that, because I think he's probably talking about child prostitutes.
Yeah, I did get that impression.
Yeah, and then I think there's so much going on, but I think he's talking about I forget whether it's particularly syphilis or venereal disease, which I think I have read could result in kids being born blind or with eye problems. And so I think the whole blast the newborn infant's tear is that the idea that this plague has been sort of brought by the husband into the marriage. So
this isn't a simple, you've made the kid cry because you're shouting at it. This could be something far more although horrible. Again,
I think with London it's so kind of replete with double and triple meanings, and it's all of the above in a way. But and then of course you kind of barrel into that final amazing image of like the marriage hearse. That where the sort of the marriage carriage is sort of transformed into the
and of course, you know, as we would now look at it, a lot of these kind of diseases are very, very preventable, curable, but not so at the time, of course.
No, presumably not. And I think it's worth saying as well that in Lambeth, where the Blakes were living when he was working on Songs of Experience, and which is from the collection in which London appears, there was very close to them an orphanage for an asylum for girls, which was not an asylum in the sense of for mentally ill people, but was for girls who were orphans or who'd been abandoned, and I think was an attempt to sort of teach them a trade so that they wouldn't end up as potentially child prostitutes. Although again, with all of the sort of that in itself being very open to abuse and sort of societal abuse.
Yeah, and makes for a very sobering ending, really, to the poem. We could talk about it being, as we said before, possibly a little bit cartoonish with these miserable-looking Londoners, but actually at the end we get a real misery, a real sense of desperation, and how presumably these people would have felt they had no option. These families would have felt that the only way to keep their heads above water would be to, engage in the human trafficking trade. Yeah,
and again, it sort of ties back, and I'm not upset going through the poem, but it ties back in with the chimney sweepers as well. And I think that's what's so effective about the poem, is that it's perhaps a sort of more the way we would think about societal problems now than perhaps in a contemporary to Blake's time, in the way that everything is sort of knock-on effects of the same social ills.
I think what I'm getting from that is that this would have been seen as quite socially progressive at the time, to almost be seen to be publicly giving a shit about something like this going on. Yeah, I think so.
And I think there was definitely, he wasn't alone in drawing attention to these things. There were there was a real contemporary campaign, for example, against the chimney sweeping trade, and how kind of awful that was. You know, there were like kids who, I think particularly chimney sweepers, would suffer from cancer of the groin and this sort of thing.
Jeez.
Completely horrific, you know, even on top of being, you know, enclosed in a chimney all day.
Weep, weep, weep.
Yeah, indeed.
We've just talked about the running in blood down palace walls, this idea of the chimney sweeper's cry, which is understandable if you've got some of those conditions we just mentioned, and the hapless soldier.
Yeah.
Obviously, at the time of Blake writing, there were foreign wars, as there are and always seem to be. What would he have been sort of making of that, do you think? What do you think his message was?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends how you read it, and there are some people who think that the hapless soldiers and the blood running down the palace walls is the soldiers mutiny, and it's a revolutionary thing. They're turning on the inhabitants of the palace, which is possible, but the way I've certainly always read it is that it's almost more of a kind of cannon fodder kind of thing. Is, you know, in the same way as the quote-unquote dregs of society and the chimney sweepers and the orphans are kind of ending up in these horrendous conditions, that the soldiers are similarly expendable pawns in the surface of, you know, imperial complex or whatever.
There's not to make reply, there's what to do and die,
Indeed.
I guess. So there's a real geopolitical backdrop to this, which comes through as quite charged.
Yeah.
The bit I've always been intrigued by is the blackening church. I often have debates with my more awake students about that's not a comment on their social wokeness or anything, that's just the ones who are still conscious. But blackening church, we've just been into a church associated with Blake, and we talked a little bit about his sort of relationship with religion, but is this quite a metaphorical blackness? Are we talking about pollution? Or could it be a bit of both?
I think it's both, and I think that's what's brilliant about the poem, is that it's like firing on all these levels. I was really pleased when we popped to, because when I suggested going to St James's Piccadilly, I thought, it's not very like black and sooty though, is it? And then when we got there, I was like, it really is. I've forgotten. It's great. So I think it is, it's playing with that idea that presumably all the churches in London, probably even more so than today, were all thick with grime and soot. But then also, I think it appalls in the sense of, I think it's more of an archaic sense of the word, in that it accuses, if you like. It's the hypocrisy of it. Because if you think about it, actually, ultimately, the responsibility to kind of look after the poor was all done parish by parish. So ultimately, it's the church who really were in charge of, what happened to these poor kind of orphans and kids who ended up, for example, as chimney sweeps.
And this is talked about in some detail in Holy Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, as well. Both versions.
Yeah, exactly. And then on top of that, there's the sense that appalls, which I think originally, or comes from the root of the word, is making white. So there's a pun on that as well. And then also the idea of like the pall sheet over the coffin, right? So it's all there. There's like 4 or 5 different things going on.
No, I never thought of that before, actually. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And in terms of the probably the bit that I really enjoy, this anaphora, if you want to get really technical, this in every of the second stanza, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice and every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Mind-forged manacles, I think, gets the credit for being the line.
Yeah, I mean, it's a banger.
It's genius.
Yeah.
But in terms of the...
I think a whole thesis has probably been written on that.
It's just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But when it comes to this, especially the word ban, I've been told that is not quite the way we'd use the word today. It's an archaic term. A ban might well be not stopping us from doing something as such, but it might actually just be an old word for shout.
I've not heard that, but I mean, that would be brilliant. And I suspect, again, like all these things are true and probably all intended, but even if they weren't, who cares?
Well, exactly, yeah.
Because I think I've not heard that would really fit. I mean, I think if there is a sense in which it's the same way we would use that word now, I think you probably are talking about the stuff that was going on with the government at the time under William Pitt the Younger, who were literally, banning radical groups from meeting. And then also, I think there's a sort of a suggestion that it's looking towards the end in the marriage hearse as well. It's the wedding bands. Different spelling.
That idea of it being a prelude to that stuff as well. Yeah, the Mindforged Manacles I just think deserves some time, really.
Yeah.
But the thing I always take away from it is this concept of how free can you really be if you have to live your life by the consensus of living in something like a city. I mean, city life is by its nature restrictive.
Yeah.
But that's kind of why people enjoy it, I feel, is that there's this sense of the collective.
Yeah.
But also a collective sense of what you can and cannot do, who you can and cannot sort of make friends with, especially in a class-divided society. But Mindforged Manacles, I think, just even now it feels like we're living in a world of polarized global views, but also even little things like some people believe that it's some people believe in some really quite toxic, politically nasty things, which you think, where have you got that from? Why are you so enslaved to that concept? And then also we all believe we're free, which is the irony.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the fact that occurs in this poem and the way it kind of hits you between the eyes is because so much of the poem seems to be pointing to external restrictions and external causes for misery, and then in a way the Mindforged Manacles suggests, well, it's up to you, right? It's not, it's internal, it's your kind of mental slavery. So there's that real tension between, to what degree can you free yourself just by working on yourself, and to what extent are you a quote unquote victim of your society, and I think that ties into what I mean about it all. It's a structural, I suppose, what we would describe it as now. So the structural societal problems that, ultimately this stuff is kind of conceptual. The roots of these various forms of oppression and degradation, and ultimately people having horrible lives, are these concepts, these kind of ill thought through, repressive, tyrannical concepts. But how do you change all that, Well, and it's interesting, I've always felt that at the end of the line, he doesn't say the Mindforged Manacles I see, which would sort of make more sense in a way. It would say he only hears them, so they're not visible. Yeah. They're in a way like Marley's chain. Yeah. They have this sort of, they are invisible, but they can be heard clanking. Or maybe he only hears them through the voices of the people when they're speaking. They're talking about their life and their lot. And, it's tempting to say, he hears it in their accent, in their dialect, in their lack of vocabulary, maybe, which would come across as very condescending if it wasn't from Blake, who himself is one of them. Yeah, and I think the other thing the poem hopefully still gets across is how bloody loud it would have been. Because you sort of think that, we're standing quite near to a traffic island now, it's a bit of traffic, you hear sort of rumble traffic. And I used to think when I was much younger, wouldn't it be nice back in the day before cars? It would have been quite. And someone pointed out to me, like, when you hear imagine like 50 horses on cobbles, and then everyone's shouting over that. Everyone's trying to like sell their wares. The streets are basically a kind of constant street market, and that was one of the kind of minor little breakthroughs, if you allow me, that I had with this poem a while back. Was it always used to bother me that it was so how does the second verse start? In every cry of every man, in every infant cry of fear. It's like, cry. It's a bit repetitive, and I used to sort of accidentally said I always thought it was every voice of every man, but that's later. But then I thought, actually, I think one of the things that is, and again, it's deliberately playing with the meanings, it's a cry of distress, the infant's cry of fear, but also these cries are the street cries of the street sellers. Aren't they? Exactly, they're shouting, they're hawking, And there are there are artwork of all this stuff. You can see all this drawings of and engravings of these guys. Everyone's selling everything from food, produce to furniture to spoons to everything. And indeed chimney sweeps. Yes. So when it's the the how's that bit go again?
Chimney sweeper's cry.
Chimney sweeper's cry. On the one hand, that is a cry of distress, and they're probably dying, you know. And on the other hand, it's just them trying to get work.
Yeah, so they could pay for pay for the bed and board.
Yeah,
little Tom Dacre can't not pay his rent.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I guess the first stanza really is it sets everything up.
There you go.
It's the podcast police. They're here for me.
Sedition.
Get him. He's boring. The bit I was interested in is that word chartered, because it's done twice.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, I always took chartered to mean it's been designed, it has been created, and possibly means that the natural world that we're living in has now ceased to have its own autonomy. You know, it's like we've filled in this particular part of. Is it the River Fleet that they filled in to try and make it easy? You know, they put canal cuttings in. So this idea that even though the Thames may be the oldest river and it's the reason why London is where it is, they managed to charter it, make it do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, and again, it's like everything else, there's probably about like 3 different things going on. I think that's definitely one of them, and I think it plays with the resemblance to charted, that sort of mapped, and like you say, the kind of idea of it's a kind of gridded off and it's constricted and you're constricted. I think it's interesting, so I looked this up, and because we've got Blake's notebook, which particularly the Songs of Experience, that's where he kind of worked them out, and you can see his revisions. It's amazing. So there were about 4 or 5 different versions of London in the notebook, and you can sort of trace how he got to
early drafts.
Yeah, exactly, and you can really see him sort of fine-tuning it. It's amazing. So the charted thing comes really late, and the charted thing originally comes from another poem which starts what do I care for the men of the Thames? And then I think it calls it's the cheating chartered Thames, something like that. And then weirdly goes on to sort of fantasize about escaping to Ohio. So it's really sort of interesting, you know, obviously post-American Revolution thing going on, those ideas of the land of liberty. And so I think he quite late in the day like transplanted the chartered from that poem to London. And up until then, I think that line went, I wander through each German street near where the German Thames does flow.
Okay.
Which is interesting, right? So I think that's partially about the Hanoverian dynasty, George III being the king, and I think it's probably to do with us, Britain, being allied with Prussia, and I'm not sure sort of Germany in the sense we understand it existed, right? But sort of Prussia and Austria and the sort of German states against the revolutionary French. And I think there was also a thing with Hessian soldiers who were kind of Germanic mercenary soldiers.
That's right.
Who were, I think had been a big deal in the American War, and then were kind of stationed in London at the time, and there was a lot of sort of possibly paranoia, possibly not, about, okay, well, why are those guys here? Is this part of the sort of government crackdown? But the chartered thing is interesting as well, because I think that speaks to quite contemporary sort of political arguments, because there was a sort of big argument going on with, on the one hand, people like Edmund Burke, who he wrote there's a long pamphlet or a book sort of arguing against the French Revolution, and sort of a lot of that was to do with how, you know, in Britain we're lucky to have these chartered rights, and this kind of goes back to the Magna Carta or the Magna Charta, right? You know, and then Thomas Paine, who Blake may have met and was certainly sort of part of they were on the sort of outskirts of the same kind of London radical circles. I think particularly in the second part of The Rights of Man, he wrote a big thing about the idea of things being chartered, that actually it's the way chartering something works is that you're excluding people, that we are all born free,
like a chartered flight now.
Exactly. If something is chartered, then it's kind of like, well, great, it's good for those people, it like belongs or has been given to those people. What about everyone else, right? So it's an exclusionary practice. And so I think in a way the way I sort of understand that chartered thing, it's almost a bit like going into parts of the city of London now and getting told off by a security guard for taking a photo, and you're like, well, this is public space, and you're like, it ain't, mate, it's not public space, it belongs to the Corporation of London.
It's quite interesting as well. On my way down here, obviously I was able to cross on the Jubilee Bridge, and I have to keep reminding myself that if I had tried to come down from that particular part of London back in Blake's time, I probably would have had to have got myself a ferry boat. The Thames as a barrier, quite literally from both banks is it has been around for a very long time, and the concepts of people living, obviously the original London Bridge, being this huge area of commerce, but also people living day to day on it. I've always thought as well with the Thames being where all of the wealth flows up. Into the Docklands. Tea, tobacco, pepper, silk. It is the and then of course later, let's not beat around the bush. Slaves, enslaved people. It's impossible to get away from colonialisation. Exactly. When looking at this poem, I think.
I think there's definitely a sense in which that's what Blake is talking about. That it's the sort of. I think in a way he's all for kind of commerce because he's from like an artisan family, and there's stuff in the later kind of weirder, harder poems about sort of again I'm paraphrasing, but the exchange of London in which all nations participate and cooperate. But there's definitely a sense in which that side of like commerce has corrupted the Thames, has corrupted the city. Develop it. Here we go. So here is more or less, if we go down here, probably quite surrounds.
Hang on. My mum warned me about going down dark alleys with members of the Blake Society.
Right. This is the
oh wow.
plaque.
So here underneath the Savoy Court, I think it says, it's it's almost a paper plate sprayed painted silver, isn't it? William Blake, poet, artist and visionary, lived and died in a house on this side, number 3 Fountain Court, 1821 to 1827, the House of the Interpreter.
So this was, I believe, put here by friends of ours who are the William Blake congregation. I think I've got that right. Sort of guerrilla blue plaque, if you like.
Are they a bit like the Judean People's Front?
Yeah, exactly. The House of the Interpreter was apparently one of the things that the ancients used to call Blake, Samuel Palmer and co, who were these sort of people in his latter days when he finally got sort of a bunch of young artists who kind of idolised him and took inspiration from him.
And what would these last 6 years of his life been like?
Pretty poor. I mean, he was still making art, still working. And working on some amazing stuff, working on the Job engravings and on the...
Inferno, was it?
Yeah, exactly, the Dante adaptation, which was sort of commissioned by John Linnell, who was kind of one of the ancients, or introduced them to him, but he sort of commissioned him to do stuff, kind of to keep him going in a way, I think, and to give him some money. But
he couldn't turn down that kind of work, I suppose.
No, and I think it was this work he wanted to do as well. It was entirely up his alley, as it were.
Yes.
Something sort of particularly delicious about like a pint in the middle of the afternoon. It feels almost kind of contraband or something.
Best kind. Cheers.
Cheers.
So we're here in the coal hole, which has some significance to Blake. What would we say would be the best way of describing this part of London where Blake saw his final days? Why was this the place he hung his hat?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think honestly, I think they were running out of options a little bit towards the end, and I believe I'm right in saying the flat in Fountain Court that they lived in and where William died was his wife Catherine's. I think it was her brother-in-law who owned the property. So I think it was a kind of an arrangement where they could get cheap rent, to be honest. But but I don't know a great deal about what's this area. What I mean, it must have been sort of pretty run down, I think, and obviously long before sort of the embankment and all that kind of thing. So, yeah.
And in terms of sort of the legacy of Blake, I suppose we're at the end of our tour. If you were to put it into simple terms, layman's terms, why does Blake continue to be relevant?
Oh God.
Big question.
Yeah, I mean, I think to take it back to London a little bit, he's kind of the eternal voice of rebellion and protest, and I think that really comes through in London. I think what you don't get in that poem, maybe, or if you do, it's only because it's sort of implied, is the other side of him, which is this sort of spiritual uplift, if you will. That it's not just criticising the way things are, it's how things could be if those mind-forged manacles fell away or were refashioned somehow.
And I suppose as someone that runs a Blake society and a group of people that obviously all come together because they love William Blake and believe that we should continue to love and preserve his work. What do you think he'd make of London today?
Do you know what? I'm sure he would be bemused and horrified and perhaps excited by how big and taller it is, and but I also don't think he'd be that surprised once he got his bearings. I think what London the poem shows us is that in a way it was ever thus, that money and power are ruling the roost and maybe not making life very pleasant for people who don't have those things. And I think Blake lived through a time of tumult and social change and revolution and demolition and rebuilding, as perhaps do we, it seems, at the moment. And I think in a way he would, once he got his bearings, maybe he'd acclimatised quite well.
Last thing I think I want to ask, and it's an open question for everyone who's listening. If you're still listening, thank you. I found myself being quite moved by listening to other work about Blake and certainly reading up on his life. To think that he was so unappreciated in his own time. I feel the same way about Van Gogh or various other artists who didn't seem to know how talented they really were. And to think that they could be in their last days, not too far from where we are now, borderline penniless, picking up whatever work they could find. I feel the same way, that idea that, geez, did no one think to tell them, by the way, you're bloody incredible? Or is that the curse of the genius that no one knows?
Yeah, I think that maybe the difference, the only thing I would dispute in that is that I think Blake did know how good he was.
Okay.
I think he knew it, and he just couldn't understand why people didn't care more than they did. And, some people did. Some people got him. And I think one of the lovely things about his life story is that in the last 10-ish years, near where we're sitting now, he was appreciated by a small kind of fervent group of admirers and artists themselves. He inspired people to make their own work and to write their own poetry and create their own artwork. But it's certainly true that he was. I think he was sort of too original and too awkward. And this is one of the things I love about him as well, is that even now, where so we're coming up to 200th anniversary of his death in 2027, and he's a hugely famous literary name. This weird thing's happened with Jerusalem, the hymn, whereby that's become this odd sort of establishment hymn, although everyone kind of thinks, depending on which group you're singing it with, they all think it means something different. But he never quite gets fully sort of absorbed in a respectable way, in the same way as, say, I don't know, Jane Austen or Shakespeare or Dickens. And in a way, that's his strength, I think. That even now he's a bit too weird and too awkward and too spiky. That he resists sort of cultural smoothing, if that's a phrase.
I guess he resists pigeonholing. Because he was kind of the triple threat. He could paint.
Yeah.
Right? He could protest.
Yeah.
He could rebel. He was all of those things. He had it all. Which, like you say, maybe made him a spiky character to come up against. And yet, in a way, we look back at some of what he's saying now and we say, right on. But yeah, Blake, wherever you are today, we raised a glass to you and we say cheers and here's to London.
Cheers, William.